Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today with me is Sondre Rasch, who is the CEO and co-founder of SafetyWing. We'll find out about SafetyWing a little bit later, but Sondre, first of all, can you tell us a little bit more about what is the secret to making remote work effective from your perspective?
The secret to making remote work effective, I think, is that you make use of the main benefit you have for hiring remotely, which is to hire from any country in the world, hire globally. And in order to do that, you have to sort of build a company bottom up to work for that purpose. So some key features is, for example, that you need to have a culture which works in that setting. You have when you hire internationally, you don't have the same shared cultural lattice that you do when everyone is working from the same city and you're kind of just building on top of that culture. So you have to provide more of a culture that will work, and a stronger one in some sense. I think you need to focus management on outputs instead of inputs. People who go down the line of sanctions and surveillance, they typically don't succeed. And well, one, it doesn't work, and two, it also isn't that great of an environment. So instead, what the most successful remote company is doing is they just change the whole structure to be focused on outputs instead of inputs, which actually, once you've done it, is actually very pleasant for the company as well. You have to set up, remote infrastructure. I love the virtual office tools. They're still pretty early, but talking to a company that was remote first, it was founded remotely, I think is a great way to get a sense of what kind of thing are needed. I also would have some in person, right? We do gatherings. We think that's a great way to, very efficiently get, most of the benefit from in-person collaboration. And then lastly, here's a temptation to avoid, which is to change salaries based on location. So intuitively, this is what you think is the main benefit of hiring internationally, which is that there's like wage arbitrage. But the problem with that is that actually remote work, the internet labor market, is its own labor market. So it's like, what is a labor market? It's like the participants in it, which jobs are available and which job applicants. So the moment someone joins your remote company, they're in the remote labor market. So if you're paying them Buenos Aires salaries, you're going to be you're going to have high churn, essentially, because they're out of the gate realize that they can apply for other such jobs. So I think a much more realistic approach is to use it to find great talent you wouldn't do otherwise. And that's how you kind of realize the wage arbitrage, not by trying to pay a world performer, a low salary.
That's interesting. But let's go back to the culture, the first point. So how do you cultivate that culture where you are in a situation where you don't share the culture with the people you hire abroad? You have a different culture, you have a different perspective. How do you cultivate that culture?
So the first thing is which values exactly is the best. And previous startup, which was also built remotely, I kind of slotted vision values, which I think is the minimum viable product of a culture, is the vision and the values. What are you doing and how, in some sense, what are you optimizing on the way there? I thought that was like corporate BS to some degree, and it can be, but what I learned is actually when it is done sincerely and well thought out, it's actually one of the few mechanisms for coordination that scales. And it's also, a source of a lot of success. It's like the personality of the hive mind. So I think that, the way you get from one person, like multiple people coming together and being like a mega brain together, is that that collaboration is efficiently, and everyone thinks for themselves, and you're able to kind of crowdsource the knowledge to be smarter together. So I'm saying all of this because you first want to get like, what are you even doing when you're trying to make a culture that works remotely? And that's roughly what I said there. You're trying to make this hive mind mega brain that can solve the purpose, which is the vision, as good as possible. So the values you have does depend somewhat on the course, although there are also some that are universal. So for example, one that we put great weight on in SafetyWing is like authenticity, which is roughly stating being the same on the inside as you are on the outside, like saying what you actually think, in conversations, but also we as a company externally. So this is, I would say, is a universal value, but it's extra important, I think, in a remote setting, because you are, it's your pro-truth pledge. But because when you communicate more by text, then there's like lower bandwidth, and so it's just more important that what comes out is correct. And a common way information can be not correct is that it's inauthentic, like they say something to get an effect instead of because that's what they think. Charitable interpretation, or like be good to each other, is another like remote friendly value that we put a lot of emphasis on, that I think is somewhat universal. And with that one, you have the fact that when people of different cultures collaborate, you sort of need to put a lot of slack in the misunderstanding account. Because and one way you can do that is by putting a high value on charitable interpretations. So someone reads something and maybe they're from a culture where you're a bit direct, to someone who's in a very polite culture, and one way to not get caught in quibbles all the time is to encourage everyone to be extremely gracious, much more than deserved, in terms of how they interpret poor communication. So that's a second one. One that is not universal, but I would say it's right for a lot of startups, is, and I think is something, we weigh both creativity or idealism. One way to think about what kind of values to have. I like this framework of loose and tight cultures a lot. So loose cultures are like, they require high creativity. Tight cultures require like high adherence. Like think of like from artist to kind of marine. And so you want to figure out like your product service, or like your mission, where does it fall in this continuum? And then you can actually infer several values based on that to make, so in our case, right, we would lean towards creativity and idealism, not as much as an artist, but a startup is making something new.
That's interesting. So when I think about culture, and I helped 22 organizations by now transition to permanent, long-term, hybrid, and remote work arrangements, one of the biggest things the clients of mine who chose to do remote did is to place a high emphasis on trust as a high value in terms of culture, because that's the biggest challenge of remote work, is building trust and building that connection to each other. Because when you think about culture, I mean, you can think in general, there are two elements. Culture is something that informs how do you and other people or your organizations make your decisions, and also how do you relate to each other. I mean, we can broadly, generally say that those are the two big elements of culture. And trust has to do with that second element, how you relate to each other. I'm curious what you found in terms of the concept of trust.
So far I don't buy trust as a value, but I think I might be wrong on this. But my hunch on it is that it's an output, and it doesn't work to optimize for it. But I'm not exactly sure. But the reasoning that is taken there, like why did we put that in, is essentially that. So we do put high value on the things that I do produce trust, right? Which includes, for example, being good to each other and authenticity, saying what you think. These kinds of things produce trust, and taking people seriously, right? So if you think about, there are only two things happening. It's like one person is talking and one person is listening. And it's like if the person is talking is doing their best and the person listening is actually listening, and is well-meaning, and it's what the person thinks, I think trust will arise over time. So you can, I do know that many traditions try to kind of go straight for the trust as a sort of like as a commitment in some sense. But to me, it seems to me that seems like a bit of, that's a lot to ask.
Fair enough. Well, also your focus on outcomes is something that builds trust. I'm curious what you've done to focus your culture, your activities, your work on outcomes rather than inputs.
Yeah, so to focus on outputs rather than inputs, that means that everyone, well, it starts with what you don't do. What do you don't do? Well, there's no set working hours, for example. There's no set inputs. People are responsible for areas and goals. So there are problems to be solved and there are goals to be reached. And they can be set, their company goals, and then they go down on teams, which produces individual quarterly or weekly goals. And over time, you can tell then goal accomplishment rate, right? And you can also say if these goals are good goals or not. And there is a feedback loop on that. So you can imagine if you have then a scenario where whether you think someone is good or not is whether they reach their goals or not, and of course also whether those goals are good or not, you will over time can have then a extremely productive company without knowing how many hours somebody's worked in a given week.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's kind of something that helps build trust. I think a lot of companies that I've observed that have a lot of trouble with permitting any degree of remote work, that are trying to have forced mandates back in the office, have pretty low trust and have a pretty high focus on inputs. What's your experience with companies that have that lower level of trust, focus on inputs, and why do you think they struggle with permitting their workers to work some of their time remotely?
Yes, I think that I've read a version about this when we reflected on charitable interpretation in the company. Essentially, what it does is when you act low trust to somebody, it's like they sink to the level you expect. So, because people want to maintain their identity and reputation. So if you treat people as if they're trustworthy, you will encourage the ones that are to live up to that, and also some in the middle to live up to that. If you treat people as if they're not, a large portion will simply sink to that because there's nothing to lose. There's no reputational or like identity payment to be made for just being like, well, if that's what you expect of me, then I guess that is who I'll be in relationship to you. So, which makes this like very, like if you have then low trust, all transactions, all cooperation becomes extremely costly because it all has to have so much sanction and control and management, and that's expensive. So, so if you can then make a high trust culture emerge, which I think we have very much succeeded with at SafetyWing, you can have one where you can be very productive with little management or surveillance or sanction, which makes people happier, but it also is a big cost saver because sanction systems are not free to enforce. Enforcement is costly. Yeah, so that's why I think they ultimately fail. Is the best people just aren't going to put up with it anyway. So you also get you also make this like self-selection into the kind of people who is like, well, like you may think it's, since this is how you think I am, that must mean you interact with low quality people, and very high good people don't want to work for your company then. So you end up often being surrounded by exactly the kind of people you're trying to catch with your control and surveillance systems, which are people who notice that you don't trust them and think, well, that sounds about right because I'm not trusting.
That's
so it's
funny.
a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. Tell me a little bit more about SafetyWing. So you work with digital nomad insurance. Tell me a little bit more about what you do, what you created SafetyWing, and where it is right now.
Yeah. So SafetyWing is building a global social safety net and also a country on the internet, ultimately. And yeah, 2 sentences of what that is. Well, the internet, I previously started a company called Superside. We want to provide benefits for the freelancers, found that nobody offered that. And so we thought, oh, this is a gap. The internet economy essentially dissolves the boundaries in the world in a sense, and for the labor market, and a lot of the infrastructure has to be rebuilt, including some big pieces like social safety net. And so we set out to build this, and we have that's our end state goal. And on the way there, we've started with health. So we started to make something called Nomad Insurance, which is an insurance for digital nomads, and which is global, simple, universal, and then also remote health insurance for remote teams. And that is used by now hundreds of thousands of remote workers worldwide, both individuals and companies. And but we're still focused on this long-term project, and more is coming out there soon. And we also have started some in Plumia, which is the arm of SafetyWing that working on building the country on the internet.
Tell me a little bit more about the arm that's building the country on the internet.
Yeah. So Plumia is a project for building country on the internet. It has as a plan to make a passport, and then we'll essentially merge that with the social safety net membership to have citizenship as a service. So it's building now a community and also doing a lot of think tank things, talking to governments, proposing policy, things like that. One extremely successful project, which is central to the plan, has been the nomad and remote work visas. And this is a trend in remote work, is that cities and countries start to compete for citizens, digital nomads and remote companies, because they can. And it's also something we want to see occur, because we think if cities and countries have a positive, sound competition here where they're trying to succeed in this new opportunity, that will be a much more pleasant transition than if they're fighting it and trying to prevent it from happening. So the nomad and remote work visas was an idea we sort of floated before COVID. And on a conference called Web Summit, this person from Barbados heard about it, proposed that when COVID happened there. And it's now been implemented by, I think, 60 countries. We spoke about this last spring. And our hope is to build on that with something called Nomad Border Pass, where you essentially can apply one place to get visa to a whole bunch of countries, kind of like Schengen. So yeah, that's one successful project so far with Plumia.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing your wisdom. Are there any last words with which you want to leave our listeners?
I would say that if you're not yet a remote worker, just understand that you're already the internet labor market is already global, and that you can apply to a job there and possibly get one that is more exciting and better paid than what you have locally, unless you live in the Bay Area. And that if you are a company, to just understand that being able to succeed with a remote team is probably over a few decades not going to be a negotiable. The difference between a company being built in a small town versus New York City is a difference in how good population you recruit people from. But the difference between New York City and the remote internet labor market is as big as from a town with 1,000 people to New York City and up to the internet. So that kind of implies to you that the companies who are building remotely and hiring globally will be the ones that succeed in the end, given how big of an input factor that is in hiring, in the quality of your team. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, and thank you to the listeners for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe to the show wherever you check this out, and make sure to leave a review, which is very helpful for other people to discover the show and helpful for us to improve the show. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. In the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.